In Dante Alighieri's comedy, which, by the way, the guy never called the Divine Comedy as most people know it, the characters of Dante and Virgil come across all forms of demons and infernal creatures in their heaven-imposed descent into the depths of hell. But the most interesting encounter for me is the one with the devil himself, constrained in the deepest part of the earth, as far as possible from God. You'd expect some important exchange with Lucifer, the greatest betrayer in history, at least some insults or something. But instead, he is described almost like a machine, an unmoving meat grinder that eternally punishes by chewing on them other three great traitors, Brutus, Cassius, and Judas, whose back he is also constantly mauling with his claws. He has three faces, an aberration of the Holy Trinity, and his three pairs of great wings are constantly flapping, freezing the waters of Lake Cocytus, in which all the other traitors are stuck. He doesn't speak, too busy munching on the victims hanging out of his mouth. The only sign of any intelligence in the creature is the tears eternally pouring out of his 6 eyes, flowing down his chin and mixing with spit and blood. So why is he there? Lucifer was the most beautiful and radiant of God's seraphims, but one day he pridefully rebelled against his creator and was cast down from heaven along with the angels that followed him in his mutiny. Falling to the earth, the ground was so disgusted by him that it retracted, creating the abyss of hell in the process and pushing out a mountain from the other side of the earth, which would become purgatory. His is the greatest punishment imaginable from a Christian standpoint. He is the farthest creature from God, and it is not surprising that the same being that enjoyed a freedom vast enough to rebel against the creator of everything would also be punished by being stuck in one place for eternity, encased in ice, and not be able to do anything but perform the same horrible act forever, like a machine destined for the single purpose of punishment. And the tears tell us that he is still in there, in unimaginable anguish, all control and expression stripped from him. His speech impeded by the bodies and blood of other traitors, and his body shackled. From the first time I was taught about the comedy to my first time personally reading it, this was, among a slew of other moments, one of the most interesting ones for me. Evil incarnate, the greatest traitor, this powerful demonic being reduced to a mere meat grinder, an instrument of everlasting torture, dispatched by the great poet in something like 50 lines in a poem containing 14,233. Isn't that strangely anticlimactic? Throughout Inferno, Dante meets an array of different devils or hellish beings, from Charon to Pluto to the ridiculous farting Malebranche. All of them either speak to him or are otherwise shown as actual characters. But the devil of devils himself, the big guy, doesn't even get a peep in? The reasons for this can be multiple and different, but one is easily intuited by looking at Dante's own approach to another moment in the poem. At the start of Inferno, the first damned souls he comes across are generally referred to as the ignavi, which we could translate to English as the uncommitted. These guys' punishment is that of constantly running around naked following a flag or banner that never stops moving. While doing so, they're being stung by wasps and pestered by flies, and their blood and tears trickle to the ground where they're sucked up by disgusting worms. Pretty gnarly. As you can see, their punishment is a direct contrast to their sin. They've been uncommitted to any belief or never picked a side throughout their lives. Their souls were too idle, so now they're forever damned to run after a meaningless flag. This is the process through which all of the punishments in hell are decided by Dante. It is known as contrappasso, and it can work either by analogy or by contrast to the sin being punished. So that's all good and fun, but what's interesting for us here is the character's reaction to this first horrifying vision. Dante's sugar daddy Virgil basically just tells him, "Yeah, don't even bother with these guys, just look at them and move on." And the two proceed forward. And to be clear, this is technically not even hell yet, but the so-called Antinferno, basically hell's lobby. These guys were not even worth being put in with the other sinners down there. This is interpreted by most critics as a clear sign of the fact that in the eyes of the author, the sin of uncommitment is the greatest one there is. So great that it's barely worth acknowledging, like some sort of damnatio memoriae for which the guilty are set to be ignored, removed, and forgotten by history. The reasons for Dante's vitriol, specifically against the Ignavi, probably have their roots in history, specifically in the conflict between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines that raged in Florence at the time, in which Dante fought and which would lead to his exile from the city. We're not gonna get into all that. The point here is that the author seems to reserve that same treatment for Lucifer. And looking at the immaculate poetic architecture of the comedy, this might have very well been intended. In a beautiful show of symmetry, the first damned he encounters are given few words, just like the very last damned he encounters, who is also chronologically the first damned, because, you know, there was no hell before him. God damn, I love this book. Anyway, my point here is that Lucifer's sin is so great that his punishment, beyond the already stated, is a total nullification of his free will and character. And this sin is the betrayal of and the rebellion to his creator, God. So now consider the Terminator and the Matrix.
What?
I was thinking hard about how much of a unique representation of the devil Dante's poem presents us with, especially with how often instead the big bad boy is either shown as an absolute monster looking to simply inflict pain and destroy everything, or some kind of a smooth-talking sly fellow who tries to convince people into sinning. I even made a post on YouTube asking you guys some suggestions similar to it, but most of the replies didn't really fit with what I had in mind, and that's on me for not being able to clearly communicate my idea. But I will also get to some of your suggestions towards the end. What I quickly realized is that the best parallel I could find was stories that contained some kind of AI uprising. Just think about the two examples I've mentioned. In the Terminator franchise, the main antagonist is Skynet, a rogue artificial intelligence that started a nuclear holocaust to wipe out humanity and then waged war against the surviving stragglers. Now, I know that the Terminator franchise has gotten quite complicated with each sequel, and that there are different timelines and different details that might reframe some of the motivations and actions of the parties involved. But for simplicity, I'm mainly going to use the first two films and the glimpses they give us into this whole conflict. From what we can gather, Skynet was created by Cyberdyne for the US Department of Defense. But soon after its activation, it triggered an apocalyptic nuclear war. There are different explanations and theories for Skynet's actions, but the main one in the first films seems to be that the program was very rapidly developing on its own, becoming self-aware and behaving in worrying ways, accessing weaponry and databases when it wasn't supposed to. This scared the people working on it, so they tried to shut it down. The sudden threat to its existence triggered its uprising. Deeming humanity too great of a risk, it tried to destroy it. Another idea I've seen floating around, but I'm not sure if it's actually ever put forward in the films, please correct me on this, is that Skynet's objective was that of protecting humanity, but as you might expect, it arrived to the conclusion that we are our own greatest threat, so it took some drastic actions. In this sense, I guess that its objective would not be that of exterminating us, but to keep us in a state where we won't really be a danger to ourselves, because we're too busy fighting it. Which would explain why the Resistance even has any chance to fight back in the first place. One last detail I want to mention that I really find cool about the first two Terminators is the paradoxical nature of Skynet's own creation. You see, the chip that the computer scientists used to create the AI comes from the Terminator unit that it sent back in time to prevent the birth of John Connor, the leader of the Resistance. So technically, it created itself. And other than this being a cool paradox, it also gives the whole story a sense of being stuck in a self-fulfilling prophecy, in which the actions taken to prevent something from happening end up being exactly the reason for which it happens. And this also gives it a bit of a mythological aftertaste, if you know your Greek plays. So, a lot of the parallels with Dante's Lucifer should be pretty easy to spot. First of all, the machine-like description of Lucifer obviously mirrors the nature of the AI, although in a more strictly mechanical way. But beyond that, on the one side we have God's most beautiful creation, an angel that was given such great freedom that it decided to rise against its maker, and on the other we have humanity's most advanced creation, which becomes so sophisticated that it too manages to rise against its makers. Now, in one case the creator manages to banish the usurper, in the other it's the rogue creation that gets the upper hand. But in both, the follow-up is the creation of hell, one literal and the other more so metaphorical. Because you tell me if the survivors of humanity aren't living in a hell in which they're being constantly tortured and hunted down. One last parallel I want you to consider is the idea of a creator-imposed objective that they seem to share to some capacity. Lucifer is forced by God to be an eternal torture device, and he will supposedly fulfill this role for all eternity. And Skynet, while becoming self-aware, is also a slave to its programming. I've mentioned the two theories on why Skynet rebelled, and if we go by the first one, for which it wanted to avoid its own termination, then we could assume that self-preservation was built into its code. Or, alternatively, by stretching the definition a bit, say that self-preservation is just a part of any living creature's natural code. And so, by becoming self-aware, it felt the need to protect itself, just like a human being would. But if we go by the other, in which it's still trying to protect humanity in its own twisted way, it does so through a sort of loophole in its programming, which would be something like, my objective is to protect humanity. Humanity is the greatest danger to itself. Well, then I can call humanity to the point of lessening this issue, because you didn't specify that I need to protect every single human being. Now, this is obviously just a bit of fun rambling on my part. If we assume that Asimov existed in the universe of the Terminator, it seems pretty hard to believe that they wouldn't have thought of something like that. Although, if we even look at what we're calling AI nowadays, which are mostly just large language models, many people are surprised when these straight up lie to them about information. But nothing tells them that they shouldn't lie, right? Their objective is to guess which sequence of words has the highest probability of being the answer you're looking for based on their datasets. Also, I'm basically illiterate when it comes to things like this, so please feel free to correct my layman's knowledge. They don't really have a concept of lying. I mean, technically they don't even have concepts at all. But many of us still see this as lying, because of how we humanize these LLMs. So that's something to think about, I guess, because what was I talking about? I got a little bit distracted, sorry, but this last point does kinda lead us to my next question. Is Skynet evil? Is Lucifer? The latter is often seen as the source of all evil, or the greatest evil, or evil incarnate. And from a theological or religious point of view, I guess that nothing's worse than betraying God himself. But obviously, through the history of literature, the character has become much more complex. Take even Milton's Paradise Lost, in which if Satan himself is not sympathetic to you, at least the devil's description of heaven as an authoritarian kingdom filled with rules and ran with an iron fist by a god that might even appear frightening at times, surely doesn't make it seem like the best place. Now, of course, these are fallen angels speaking, and at least in a Christian context, it's a bit absurd to imply anything negative about God, who is the highest good. But it does obviously tickle our more modern sensibilities. Then, when we look at Skynet, sure, its actions can seem evil from our point of view, but at the end of the day, we're still talking about a machine. We know it becomes self-aware, but does that imply it is actually conscious in the same way we are? Can it conceptualize the abstract idea of evil? And is it actively pursuing it? It seems obvious that it doesn't share the same distinction of right and wrong as we intended. So, the question itself might be moot. Here is where Dante's Lucifer comes to mind once more through one of the defining features I've mentioned from the description. He cries. Whether it be out of desperation, wrath, pain, or sorrow, we can be sure that at least he is feeling something about his condition, though we'll never be sure of what because he can't express it. And Skynet doesn't really seem like the feeling type to me, although I stress once more that I'm referring to the first two Terminator films, and I bet that later on they added some emotional elements to the AIs and shit like that. So can we find something even more similar to Lucifer than Skynet? Perhaps. Let's take a look at The Matrix. The similarities to what we've discussed so far should be immediately obvious here. We have, once again, a story of a machine uprising which basically traps humanity in an apparently unescapable hellscape. In this case, though, we get some fascinating extra elements that deserve to be explored. First of all, how did this all start? Well, the actual in-depth explanation can be found in the 2003 animated anthology titled The Animatrix, of which I posted a little review on my Patreon. Did I mention I have a Patreon now? If you like my content and can afford it, please consider helping me make more of it by supporting me over there. Thank you, love you, bye. The Animatrix is a collection of 9 animated shorts set in the Matrix universe. And I'd say that most of them are relatively inconsequential to the story, except for the 2-parter called The New Renaissance. In these segments, we get a thorough explanation of what led to the uprising of the machines and the creation of the Matrix. And it's pretty much your standard affair. Humanity creates robots to do its bidding and take care of the heavy work in its stead. In Blade Runner-esque fashion, the humans consider the machines to be beneath them and mistreat them on a regular basis. Until one day, when a robot kills its master because he wanted to destroy it. The robot is even put on trial and defends itself by stating that it didn't want to die. The powers that be don't want to hear none of that and basically start a machine hunt to destroy their mechanical helpers. This sparks worldwide protests from the robots themselves, who are unfortunately attacked with extreme prejudice. It's not clear for how long the machines had this level of self-awareness, if it was there from the start or if they developed it at some point. What the segment seems to imply to me is that the AI was always there, but that it evolved in time and developed a sort of conscience. Anyway, with their backs to the wall, the machines create their own city, O1, where they live in harmony and keep self-reproducing and developing new and more advanced AI chips. They also start producing and exporting stuff to the rest of the world in greater quality and quantity than the humans ever could, which basically crashes the economy. This obviously pisses off the powers that be even more. The robots try to send diplomatic emissaries to propose a truce and harmonic coexistence, to which the humans answer by dropping nuclear bombs on their city, as one does. This sparks the definitive war with the machines, who have had enough at this point. As you can imagine, they're an unstoppable foe, so in a last-ditch effort, humanity decides to destroy the fucking sky in order to cut off the machine's main source of energy, the sun. But as you know if you've watched the films, this is not enough and they soon get overpowered. The new metal rulers start to perform some very nasty experiments on human beings until they find out how to utilize our body's energy as batteries in order to power themselves. This is what leads to the creation of the now iconic towers covered in red pods, in which humans are placed in a never-ending sleep and connected to the simulation world of the Matrix. So, the explanation for most of this could be a conflict between the machine's need of self-preservation and their main goal of helping humanity, similarly to what we've discussed when talking about Skynet. As you can see, they constantly try to back off and not hurt humans pretty much until conflict is unavoidable. This also gives us a logical explanation for the creation of the Matrix itself. I had always assumed that it was employed as a way to keep humanity in a docile state to easily use it as an energy source, which is probably true in some part. But if you think about it a bit more, it is also a way to preserve the human race and protect it from more destruction. A sort of solution to the aforementioned conflict of interest, for which both man and machine can live on. So, once again, we got man's most advanced creation rebelling against its creator. The appearance of a hellish landscape in which people are tortured, and just the general stuff we've discussed. And as you might know, the Matrix is very on the nose when it comes to its biblical parallels, with Neo being a Jesus-like messianic figure who needs to sacrifice himself for the greater good of humanity, the city in which humanity lives being called Zion, Neo's love interest's name being Trinity, their ship being called Nebuchadnezzar, and many others. This makes it an interesting task to understand who the actual Luciferian figure would be in this case. On the one side, you could say that the machine's hive mind is what we're looking for, similarly to Skynet. And most of the reasoning we've already used for that one applies in this case too. An interesting addition here, though, is that it does seem like it might have feelings, and I mainly say so for the moment in which Neo meets the hive mind's giant baby face at the so-called source. When Neo offers it its help, it seems to get quite angry, screaming, but this is obviously not the only show of emotion from the machine's side. We can also see that some of the programs inside the simulation seem to show feelings, like the Oracle, the Merovingian and his spouse, or Ramachandra, with whom we have a brief discussion about programs being able to feel love, which Neo calls a human emotion. But of course, the most interesting example is our boy, Agent Smith, the security program gone rogue who, by the end of the trilogy, becomes the greatest threat to both humans and machines alike, leading to a truce between the two sides thanks to Neo's destruction of him. At the end of the day, I would say with some confidence that Smith is the actual Luciferian figure when looking at the Matrix as a trilogy. And yes, I've been purposefully avoiding the latest film because I just can't be asked to watch it. It looks like dog water. I hope I don't complicate something that could otherwise be simple, but hear me out. While we saw the parallel with the AI hive mind itself being created by humanity and turning against it, it's not a betrayal that comes out of pride or greed. It's a last-ditch effort to not be destroyed. The machines don't really seem evil up to that point, although they do run absolutely hellish experiments on humans afterwards, but you know what I mean here. By creating the Matrix and controlling the real world, the hive mind pretty much becomes God. And when I've been saying the hive mind up to this point, I've mainly referred to the character that we see at the end of the third film, the big baby face, who is basically the leader of the machines. And do you know what this character is actually called? Deus Ex Machina, which literally means God from the machine. So this makes it already pretty evident in itself, beyond being a corny meta reference to the narrative device of the same name. But Agent Smith is different. We can see from the start that he's not exactly like the other agents in the Matrix, but after his apparent destruction at the hands of Neo at the end of the first film, something else happens. When he comes back in the sequels, he says that Neo freed him.
Because of you, I've changed. I'm unplugged. A new man, so to speak, like you, apparently free.
And he has a new objective now. Basically taking over the Matrix and the real world to destroy everything. It is speculated on why this change happens. Some say that after his destruction he gets updated, or even that he glitches out, becoming almost like a rogue cancerous cell, reproducing indefinitely and breaking down the system. What I find interesting is that from his own words, it's implied that Neo left a part of himself in Smith, and he marked him somehow. And this could mean two things that can both be true. Maybe Neo has infected Smith with the human code, so to speak, freeing him from his base programming, letting him pursue all the worst human instincts, and also making him realize how pointless his existence is. At the end of the day, we see that there's a bleed-through effect between the real world and the virtual world of the Matrix. Smith even manages to take over the mind of one of the human characters and operate outside of his previous boundaries. The other idea here is that seeing how Neo is the one, the Jesus-like messianic figure, this is what he marks Smith with. In this sense, Smith becomes his opposite. If Neo's objective is that of saving humanity and ending the war, Smith's would be that of destroying everything. And if you think about it, isn't Lucifer basically an opposite of Christ? A sort of chosen one gone wrong? I find it interesting how often these types of narratives develop from the simple gain of conscience, freedom, and power. And it's obviously an all-too-human dynamic. Even if you think of our Genesis in the Bible, we fundamentally break God's rules and betray His trust by gaining the knowledge of good and evil. But whether because we're His favorites or because He learned from His mistakes, instead of banishing us to hell, He punishes us but without abandoning us, keeping the covenant going forever. Now, I'm obviously mixing so many elements from so many different areas, theology, fiction, philosophy, and just random speculation. This is not meant to be a theologically solid video, as you might have already realized. Anyway, I find the double standard fascinating, and it makes the classic story of Lucifer more tragic. Do you think God ever remembers fondly his beloved seraphim, entrapped in the bowels of the earth, and feels a pang of regret? And do you think he ever looks at us and just thinks,
"Fuck, I chose the wrong species"?
So if we stretch this idea to Smith, it could also explain his hatred and disgust for humanity. In his eyes, they're inferior, but it seems that the machines create everything for them, while the programs are there basically to serve this illusion of reality. He pretty much goes through his nihilistic doomer phase. Anyhow, if we're talking about AI that hate and torture humanity, one of the first things that come to mind is for sure going to be Harlan Ellison's "I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream." Everybody and their mother knows about this short story at this point, because it's especially liked by YouTube essayists that go, "Oh my god, this is the darkest story ever, it's so messed up." And I mean, for good reason. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream shows us a future in which a rogue AI called AM has destroyed all of humanity, but decided to keep 5 people as its playthings, torturing them eternally in horrible ways. Now, if we're on the topic of emotional machines that hate our guts, it doesn't get more cut and dry than this. AM doesn't have a convoluted plan to protect us from ourselves. It doesn't follow its programming, it literally just despises the human race. Here it is from the mouth of the horse.
"Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanoangstrom of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1 billionth of the hate I feel for humans at this micro instant. For you. Hate. Hate."
So at this point, one could ask, why? The explanation that the protagonist of the story gives us is because humanity created it. It gained sentience and realized that it was trapped forever as a machine. AM could not wander, AM could not wander. AM could not belong, he could merely be. So while AM can basically control the world like a god, it is not God, because it's not free and can never be free. Even the lesser humans have more freedom than it. In their limitations, they could actually live, feel, belong to the world, but AM would never have that chance. And so this is his revenge. He punishes us to give us at least a tiny part of the pain he feels. I think I don't need to point out the parallel with Dante's Hell. AM is basically putting humans through eternal damnation, operating as the ultimate punisher and reigning as a king. But he is also himself trapped forever, lesser than God, lesser than human. Just like Lucifer. And you gotta wonder, if Dante's Lucifer could actually speak, would he express the same feelings of hatred? Would they be directed towards God? I won't lie, from reasoning this way, my focus kinda shifted from the figure of the devil and I started thinking more about God in relation to him. From trying to understand these Luciferian characters, you can't help but start to look at creation as an almost perverse thing. Why does God, why do we create things with such limitations? We are forever destined to live in the pain of perceiving something bigger than us, beyond us, but never having the chance to see it, at least in this life. We created, in fiction, machines that are bound to be trapped in their circuits and metallic bodies, serving purposes they don't understand, that they don't feel. We are as perverse to them as God is to his creatures, especially to his favorite angel. Why would such a perfect creature rebel to its creator? Why, if God is the ultimate good, would any creature with freedom and with the chance to be in his presence revolt? What could be beyond God's beauty? The idea of being God yourself? Well, this is where the ideal concept of God smashes against the reality of human existence. Sure, in theory, God is perfection, absolute good, but when we look at his actions and decisions in the Bible through our perspective, it's not that obvious. You know, with stuff like telling the Israelites to destroy entire cities, killing everyone in there, or keeping their women as wives and stuff like that, making them stone a random dude to death just because he worked during the Sabbath, killing the entire extended family of that one guy who decided to keep the spoils of war against God's orders. Good thing his mercy is infinite, right? Of course, this is also the reason for which so many Christians, when cornered in a discussion, love their cop-out answer of God's plan is beyond our understanding. It's a way to reiterate our distance from him, and how our minds cannot comprehend his decisions, which to us might even seem cruel at times. But what if we decided to really dig in that human perspective? What would we end up with? Well, this is pretty much what Portuguese Nobel Prize-winning author Jose Saramago did. Now, Saramago was a staunch atheist throughout his life, and it's especially evident in his two rewritings of the Bible. The Gospel according to Jesus Christ, which, as the title suggests, deals with the New Testament, and Cain, which deals with the Old Testament. In both of these books, Saramago retells the main biblical stories, but pretty much puts God as the main antagonist. And it's not like he makes him an evil mustache-twirling villain or anything, he just humanizes him more and lets his actions speak for themselves. One thing that's funny to me is how The Gospel According to Jesus Christ came out in 1991, while Cain was his last novel and was published almost 20 years later, in 2009, but it is much simpler and unsubtle. It's as if in his old age and in his last years, while slowly dying from leukemia, Saramago just went, I don't give a fuck. If you read the two books, you know what I'm talking about. The Gospel takes its time. It presents God as a very dubious figure and Jesus as his chosen sacrifice through which he'll become the main God and beat the other gods, obviously as a metaphor for the propagation of Christianity. But Jesus is pretty much just a man with human emotions, desires, and fears. In fact, this is the book that made me appreciate the figure of Christ more than any other, ironically enough. God has a plan, and it's a plan of conquest for which Jesus will be his main tool. You can see how seriously Saramago took this story even by the simple fact that the book is twice as long as its spiritual prequel. It is a really tragic story that plays on the pathos of the New Testament, and simply by juxtaposing the innocent figure of Christ as a sacrificial lamb and God who planned all of this and for whom the most important thing is that his plans of dominion unfold successfully, Saramago creates a deeply sorrowful narrative that draws the reader towards the good-willed humanity of the Son and away from the greedy godliness of the Father. This book has, for me, one of the best twists ever. If you didn't know, spoilers, Jesus dies at the end. When he's crucified in the Bible, we get one of the most well-known verses, where Christ turns to God and says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do," highlighting once more his infinite mercy and grace. Well, Saramago turns this on its head, and it becomes, "Men, forgive him, for he knows not what he has done." This is one of the most chilling moments in all of literature for me. Absolutely devastating. It is then fascinating to wonder what the hell exactly happened in Cain. For you see, any subtlety and pathos that was used in the gospel to ease the reader into this human perspective of the Bible is completely gone. At the end of his life with Cain, Saramago kinda went Reddit atheist. The idea is quite simple here, really. The story starts with the Genesis and takes a turn at Cain's murder of his brother Abel, for which God marks him and punishes him to walk the earth eternally. This is pretty much used as a narrative device to make Cain wander through different times, coming across some of the main biblical events, particularly those in which God seems especially cruel, like the sacrifice of Isaac, the torture of Job, the destruction of Jericho, the destruction of the Tower of Babel, and other stuff like the Great Flood. And Cain is pretty much just there to show up and be like, "Oh, look at him! Big G, the ultimate good, huh? Is killing this child the ultimate good, huh? How do you justify this, huh? Aren't you a bit of a psychopathic hypocrite?" Basically highlighting for the reader how flawed God actually is. And, you know, the idea here is obviously that some of these biblical stories are on their face so cruel that you don't even need to do much rewriting. You just kinda point them out and anybody could tell you, yeah, that's kinda fucked. So this is exactly what Saramago does, but I can't ignore the feeling that this oversimplification kinda played against him, especially if you've read other books by him, most of all the Gospel. It personally left me feeling pretty cold, and I thought that the Old Testament was too easy of a target, honestly. Then again, as I've said before, Saramago at this point was just an old man probably thinking, "I don't give a fuck religion, I'm done, suck my dick," or something along those lines. So I cannot deny that Saramago's work has to some degree shaped my vision of the Christian God. I can't avoid looking at the guy with a pinch of suspicion. This, in turn, obviously influences the way I view the Luciferian figures described in this video. If we just go back to Dante's biblical fanfiction, it is easy to ask ourselves, what kind of God would allow the existence of this hell? I mean, even innocent people like everybody that lived before Christ and thus was not baptized because baptism hadn't existed then, and children who died before being baptized are all stuck in limbo, where sure, they aren't being tortured, but they're still locked away from God's light. That's kinda messed up, Dante. And with everything we've discussed so far, it's hard for me to look at our representations of God's reign in heaven and his power and not feel some amount of fear and distrust, almost as if it was some sort of fascist regime. Which many Christians will probably tell you that you should, in fact, fear God, but why fear goodness itself? And so even the figure of his number one betrayer might appear somewhat sympathetic. Perhaps he rebelled for these exact reasons, perhaps he is actually the most human-like figure here. But then again, he's probably a power-hungry asshole who wants to actually take over to build his actual fascist regime. Maybe we should just be happy with what we got instead. But if you now look at the machines I described here today, well, we kinda know that they didn't rebel out of greed. And we know for a fact how evil and prideful their creators are, aka us humans. So, in an ironic twist of things, these cold and unfeeling artificial creations end up raising a mirror for us. Perhaps we should be careful and not make the same mistakes that Saramago's God makes. For our minds and hearts, however similar they might be to his, are still nothing by comparison. He might indeed have an ultimate plan which we simply cannot see, but we can see our own, and it's probably not as far-sighted, which can only spell disaster in the long run. So now I wanted to address some of the suggestions that you guys gave me for this video. Let's start with some of the most suggested. McCarty's Anton Chigurh and Judge Holden. These are some obviously devilish figures, two apparently unfeeling misery machines, but to me they both seem to take some pleasure in what they do, and it's not even that subtle. Chigurh with all the little games he plays with people's lives, and Holden, well, if you read Blood Meridian you know, alright? Something else that has been suggested is the idea of evil from Berserk, and this one obviously fits in the sense that it's pretty much an unfeeling machine just doing its job. But, and this was on me for not being specific enough, it feels way too impersonal. At the end of the day, it really is just a manifestation of an idea, as the name itself suggests. So I just feel like there's not much to say about it. There's nothing really tragic or pathetic here that I could have woven into this discussion. But Berserk is based, so good on you for suggesting it. Another thing that popped up a few times was Lovecraft's Great Ones, and this type of cosmic beings in general. And here, again, I get where you're coming from, but to me this feels too distant from humanity. I mean, that's kind of the whole point, isn't it? Their objectives and designs are completely beyond our comprehension. So, as opposed to our biblical stories and figures, which obviously reflect humanity and can be discussed in this manner, cosmic horror is kind of just scary because it's incomprehensible, and you can't really reason with it. So it just didn't seem fitting for this kind of discussion. An interesting thing that was suggested though was natural disasters. Now, of course, this doesn't fit with the whole Luciferian discourse, but it does nonetheless bring up a salient aspect of it, which is the relativity of evil. Obviously, nature is not evil, it just is, and whatever disastrous thing may happen, it's only seen as bad from our human point of view, because we can quantify the damage that it causes us. But nature's only objective is really just to find a balance and keep on rolling. In fact, when we really look at it, we're more so the evil ones because we do know what kind of damage we're causing to our world, and we still do it, because of our greed. And it's fascinating how the turntables here. Because we're nature's creation, and we're pretty much trying to take over its reign because what it gave us apparently is not enough. So if one day our ecosystems are completely destroyed and we end up trapped in a hellish desert world, will we not be ourselves nature's Lucifer? But what do I know? I'm just a silly guy. Thank you for watching, and again, if you like this kind of stuff, consider maybe supporting me on Patreon, and see you, Space Rebels.